I was holding my newborn when my entire world was quietly taken apart in front of me, not by strangers, not by fate, but by the two people who were supposed to protect me. My body was still shaking from childbirth. My stitches still burned every time I moved. My son was barely 3 days old, wrapped against my chest like the only piece of peace left in a life that had suddenly turned unrecognizable. And in that fragile silence of a hospital room, my father looked at me like I was a burden he had finally grown tired of carrying. "Once you recover," he said coldly, adjusting his watch as if this conversation was an inconvenience, "you should return to your in-laws. You cannot stay here." My mother didn't even look at me when she spoke next. Her arms were folded, her expression carved in stone. "You're not our responsibility anymore, Rita. You never really were." Those words didn't come out like shouting. They came softly, cleanly, like something rehearsed long before I was even born. My husband had just died in a fire at his workshop. One moment I was a wife, the next I was a widow holding a child who would never hear his father's voice. And in that moment, I had nothing. No home I could return to. No stability. No safety net. Just pain, exhaustion, and silence. So I stayed quiet. Not because I agreed, but because something inside me understood that speaking in that moment would not save me. They mistook that silence as defeat. But it wasn't a defeat. It was an observation. Because while they were busy deciding how easily they could remove me from their lives, I was noticing everything. The way my father avoided my eyes. The way my mother refused to look at my baby. The way the folder in her hand wasn't emotional, it was prepared. Paperwork. Signatures. Structure. Control disguised as concern. And something about that didn't feel like abandonment. It felt like planning. I didn't know it yet, but that moment was not the end of my life as I knew it. It was the beginning of something I would later struggle to even name. 2 days later, everything changed. I remember the sound first. Footsteps in a hospital hallway always sound tired, slowed by exhaustion, softened by fear. But these footsteps were not tired. They were deliberate. Heavy shoes against a polished floor. Measured pace. No hesitation. I looked down at my son, Owen, sleeping against my chest. His tiny fingers curled like he already knew he was holding onto the only thing that was safe in this world. The door opened. My father walked in first. No greeting. No warmth. No acknowledgement of what I had just survived. His eyes moved across the room like inventory. For stand. Bed. Monitor. Paperwork. Not once did he look at my son. Behind him came my mother, holding a folder so tightly it looked like it belonged more to her than anything human ever could. She placed it on my lap without a word. "No, how are you?" "No, we're sorry." Just silence and documents. My father spoke first. "When are you being discharged?" Not, "How are you feeling?" Not, "Can we see the baby?" Just logistics. I answered weakly, "A few more days. They want to monitor me." He checked his watch. Once. Then again. As if my recovery was interfering with his schedule. Then he said it. "We need to talk about what happens next." Something in my stomach tightened. Owen shifted slightly against my chest. My father continued, voice flat. "Aaron's family should handle this. You have in-laws." I stared at him. "Handle what?" He looked at me like I was slow to understand. "You." The situation. The word situation hit harder than I expected. Not person. Not daughter. Not mother. Situation. Then came the sentence that divided my life into before and after. "You cannot come back home with us. We are not equipped for this." My mother nodded without hesitation. "You're an adult now, Rita. Figure it out." I looked down at my son's sleeping face. His hospital bracelet was still new, still clean, still too large for his wrist. "You're saying this now?" I whispered. My father didn't pause. "Once you recover, go back to your in-laws. We don't want you here." My mother finally added, as if closing a file, "We are done being responsible for you. We always have been." The room fell into a silence so deep it felt like air stopped existing. Owen made a tiny sound in his sleep. Then my mother opened the folder. Insurance papers. Highlighted lines. Signature boxes waiting like traps disguised as routine. "Sign here," she said. "Here." And here, I didn't move. Not because I was agreeing, but because something in me had stopped reacting and started remembering. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly have known, was that the foundation of everything had already been laid long before that hospital room. Months before the fire. Before the loss. Before I became someone sitting in a bed holding a child while being erased from her own family. It began with my father's arrival at our home one Sunday afternoon. He came with his old leather briefcase. The same one he had carried during his insurance years, even though he had retired long ago. He said it was just a visit. But nothing about that day felt casual. He talked about protection, about responsibility, about ensuring the baby would never suffer financially. He spoke about life insurance like it was love in numerical form. And then he named a figure. $825,000. Not suggested. Not discussed. Declared. My husband, Aaron, tried to question it once. Gently. Carefully. Why that number? My father didn't answer directly. Instead, he made it about responsibility. About love. About being a provider. And slowly, through pressure and persuasion, through guilt disguised as guidance, we signed the documents. Because we trusted him. Because I trusted him. At the time, I thought it was safety. Later, I understood it was something else entirely. Structure. Control. Preparation. Then came the fire. 2:06 a.m. And Aaron was gone. And I was left in a hospital bed trying to understand how a life could disappear so completely that even grief felt unanchored. The days that followed were a blur of medical rooms, paperwork, and silence. But something in me refused to stay quiet forever. Because grief has a strange companion. Curiosity. Curiosity starts asking questions no one wants you to ask. Why did my father arrive at the scene so quickly? Why did he contact Aaron the night before? Why did certain documents feel incomplete? Why was page 3 missing from the insurance forms? That missing page mattered. It wasn't just paperwork. It contained rights. Options. Choices I was never shown. Someone had removed it deliberately. And suddenly, my silence in that hospital room from days earlier didn't feel like surrender anymore. It felt like observation becoming strategy. So I made a call. A fire investigator. Someone who had worked with Aaron before. When I mentioned my father's arrival time at the fire scene, the tone on the other end changed immediately. Because the timeline didn't make sense. And once something doesn't make sense, professionals don't ignore it. They dig. The night everything collapsed began quietly. A fire marshal arrived. Then a detective. Then the documents. Receipts. Logs. Phone records. And slowly, piece by piece, the shape of something unthinkable began forming. A receipt for accelerant purchase days before the fire. Security footage placing my father at the hardware store. Text messages asking Aaron if he was alone that night. And the most disturbing detail of all. He arrived at the fire scene before emergency responders. That shouldn't have been possible. Unless he was already close. Unless he was waiting. Unless he knew. And in that hospital room, when those questions were finally spoken aloud, something inside me didn't break. It settled. Like something had finally stopped shaking. When my father realized what was happening, it wasn't anger that appeared first. It was fear. Not loud fear. Controlled fear. The kind that shows up when someone realizes their version of reality is no longer the one in control. Then came panic. Then denial. Then movement. He tried to leave. But leaving doesn't erase evidence. And running doesn't erase patterns. People don't flee questions unless answers are already dangerous. That's what I clearly understood that day. Not everything that runs is innocent. By the end, everything was exposed. The insurance plan. The timing. The fire. The intent. The manipulation. The removal of missing information. The attempt to control what happened after I gave birth alone. It wasn't chaos. It was designed. And when that realization fully formed, I didn't feel dramatic collapse. I felt something quieter. Finality. My mother, however, did not face charges. She faced the truth. Not legal truth. Emotional truth. She hadn't lit the fire. But she had stood beside someone who treated my pain as inconvenience. She had looked at me in that hospital room and chosen distance over instinct. And that choice mattered. Because absence is also a decision. And decisions have weight. I didn't forgive her. Not because I hated her, but because forgiveness without change becomes repetition. And I had already lived through too much repetition disguised as family. Months later, I moved. Not dramatically. Not in escape. But in rebuilding. A smaller place. A quieter life. A slower rhythm. My son grew. He smiled without knowing anything about the world he entered. And slowly, I learned something I hadn't known before. Silence can be survival. But peace requires distance. Now my father waits for trial. And I will be there. Not to destroy him, but to state what happened clearly enough that it cannot be rewritten. Because truth doesn't need anger to exist. It only needs presence. And somewhere in all of this, I learned something I didn't expect. Family is not a guarantee. It is a behavior. It is something people choose to show or fail to show. And when it is absent long enough, you are allowed to stop waiting for it. Even if it hurts. Even if it reshapes your entire understanding of love. I chose my son. Not because it was easy, but because it was clear. And clarity, once you finally see it, becomes something you cannot unsee again. I chose truth. I chose survival. I chose a future that did not require me to shrink myself to fit into someone else's version of care. And I would choose it again. Every single time.